Hey all, it's Matt, your average gamer, and for this video we're going to be doing more fun builds. This was a really enjoyable one to do, and we're going to be covering a whole bunch of different weapons that I either haven't covered in a very long time or haven't covered at all, and I honestly cannot wait to get into this one. The first build up here is for the Grafted Blade Greatsword. This is a greatsword that's really powerful in terms of AR, does a lot of physical damage, and the Ash of War will actually boost your levels by 5 in each stat for around 40 seconds. Also, be sure to comment below your most fun build. What build is most fun for you? What weapon is most fun for you? Comment below and let me know. Back to the Grafted Blade Greatsword, really good for physical damage, does a good amount of poise damage by the way on charged and jump attacks. You can also grab this early in Weeping Peninsula at Castle Morn, and the boost in levels is substantial, especially early in the game. This is one I definitely recommend trying out, and I know I always say recommend most of my builds, of course I do at the end of the day, but for this one, we're not really spamming an Ash of War. We're getting in for physical melee hits, and we're doing a whole bunch of charge and jump attacks to get as much posture damage as we can and hit stuff really hard. A little bit different than my normal builds. Is it the most overpowered build? Probably not, but it is powerful enough, and we are on New Game Plus 7 here after all for all footage. Let's jump into equipment. For equipment, we have the Grafted Blade Greatsword, preferably plus 10, any seal for buffs. We're using the Raptor's Black Feathers. We have the Ritual Shield Talisman, Claw Talisman. We have the Axe Talisman, Urtry's Favorite plus 2, Spike Crack Tier, Faith Tier. Let's jump into stats. And for stats, this is very much a strength build. We're maxing our strength stat when we're two-handing it. We have 35 endurance. We have a lot of endurance for a couple of the strength builds I did on here to make sure that we can carry the weight and all that. We have 60 vigor, 20 mind. We have 15 dexterity, 25 faith with a Faith Tier. We're using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength to buff this, centered around jump attacks and charge attacks. The next one up here is the Frost King, and this is one of my favorites on this list because it centers around the Royal Greatsword, which is a weapon with really high AR and essentially has a frost version of Lion's Claw. Now, you are splitting your damage here because it is an intelligence and a strength weapon. It's obviously a strength weapon first and foremost, but it does have decent intelligence scaling too to add some magic damage, and you do have split damage between the physical and elemental side. The only downside to splitting damage is how damage is calculated when you're fighting bosses. If you are splitting stats, it can be a little bit harder. You need a little bit more AR essentially to make up for it. By the way, at max stats, the Royal Greatsword will have over 1,000 AR. I think it gets around like 1,050 or something with max stats, which is pretty incredible. By the way, to mention real quick in terms of talking about that, I had this at plus 9. Had I had it at plus 10 with 60 strength, two-handing it, 40 intelligence, we would have had around 900 AR, which is pretty great for rune level 150. At the end of the day, it's a powerful weapon with a Frost Ash of War. Now, there is no innate Frost buildup on the weapon, that's the one downside, but the Ash of War is quite powerful, and I recommend using this one for fun. This is a really fun weapon to use, as Lion's Claw can be quite good, and it's a Frost version of it, so you can't really go wrong here. Let's jump into equipment. We have the Royal Greatsword, any seal for buffs. We have Ronin's Greaves, Knight's Cavalry Armor, Blade Set. We have the Great Helm. Part of Blade Set, Shard of Alexander, Ritual Sword and Shield Talisman, Urtry's Favorite plus 2, Magic Tier, Faith Tier. Let's jump into stats. Real quick, I wanted to go for a cooler armor set, but the Spellblade set will boost the magic part of this Ash of War, but it only boosts the total damage on the Ash of War by about 5 or 6% instead of 8, so for me it wasn't worth not having the 51 poise and decent defense. Two-handed, we have 60 strength, we have 40 intelligence, 25 faith with a Faith Tier, 60 vigor, Golden Vow, and Flame Grant Me Strength. The next one up here is Eleonora's Sacred Build. This is a combination build using both Eleonora's Pole Blade and Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear. Now, interestingly enough, even though it's a strength arcane weapon, the Ash of War on Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear scales primarily with your arcane stat. Which means that when you're combining these, you can actually focus on Eleonora's Pole Blade for physical damage and using the Ash of War there, because that's going to factor in a lot with what you put into the weapon. But for Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear, you could switch to the Ash of War, use the Shard of Alexander, and still get great damage. Which makes it a solid combination build if you're quick enough to switch stuff, because you will need to two-hand Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear to use the Ash of War Blood Boon Ritual. By the way, I did get killed by Radahn once on New Game Plus 7, ended up getting him on the second try. Eleonora's Pole Blade, by the way, as I was trying to pick up my runes there, does both physical and fire damage and scales actually quite well with arcane, despite the fact that it seems to show that it scales better in dexterity. You actually get a lot of damage out of arcane, and Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear, as mentioned, is more strength on the weapon, more arcane on the weapon art. Yeah, Eleonora's Poleblade has some weird scaling with that. As far as the weapon itself, it'll tell you it's really strong at dex, but the fire damage and the bleed is going to scale with arcane, so you actually get a ton of arcane points too, to make sure you soft cap that for both of these at 45. That's actually why Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear is so good if you pump up arcane. In this case, we only have 45 because we built around Eleonora's Poleblade a bit, but if you pump up arcane to 60 or 80, you get absurd damage out of Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear because of how the Ash of War scales. And Radahn did get down to only a little bit of health. I probably could have phased him had I not gotten hit and messed up there in the beginning, but switching between the two can be a little bit complicated. However, with the right talismans and setup, it can actually turn into a very powerful build. So you're getting one of the most broken Ashes of War in the game in Blood Boon Ritual, which you can get a ton of damage, and then you're also getting Eleonora's Poleblade, which is one of the most fun weapons to use in the entire game in my opinion. I have a regular build for it on my alternate channel I just posted. I'll leave that in the description. Let's jump into equipment. For equipment, we have Eleonora's Poleblade, Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear. We're using the Dragon Community Seal, White Mask, no need for the Raptor's Black Feather Shear, Shard of Alexander, Millicent's Prosthesis, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Runway Sword Insignia, Fire Tier, Fate Tier. Let's jump into stats. For stats, we have 60 Vigor, 45 Dexterity, 45 Arcane. We're using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength to buff this. By the way, with one of the successive attack talismans, you can actually replace that with Ritual Swords Talisman, and that will also boost the damage on Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear, Ash of War, Blood Boon Ritual. The next one up here is a build for the Crescent Halberd. The Crescent Halberd was requested on my channel from a couple different people, and it's an interesting weapon because it scales with an S and Arcane, and it also, like the Ripple Blade, you can use greases that will scale with the weapon and your Arcane stat. But unlike the other option for scaling greases, this one has spinning weapon on it, which could add up to a lot of bleed buildup, and you don't lose any physical damage because the weapon's just going to be straight arcane, and you're going to have probably between 600 and 650 AR, which isn't too bad either. By the way, Sporific Grease, Poison Grease, and Blood Grease will all scale with the arcane on this weapon. Let's jump into equipment. For equipment, we have the Ripple Crescent Halberd. We're using the Dragon Communion Seal. We have the White Mask, Shard of Alexander, Millicent's Prosthesis, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Rottenwing Sword Insignia, and then we have the Thorny Tier, Fate Tier. We're also using Blood Grease and Margit Shackle to stun him. And then for stats, with 70 Arcane at any time, you could switch to the Scavenger Curved Sword build with stats like this. We have 60 Vigor, 20 Mind, 26 Endurance, 20 Dexterity. We're using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength to buff this, and of course we're using the Blood Grease too, which will give you around 100 plus bleed buildup. And the next one up here is the Dragonscale Blade. A lot of people requested this as a build, and I decided to build around it for the first time in probably over a year. It is lower on my list in terms of katanas, but it does have a cool Ash of War and Ice Lightning Sword. I mean, Ice Lightning Sword on its own sounds really cool, and it actually adds lightning damage and I believe frost buildup too on the weapon, which you think would be fantastic and a huge addition for the weapon, but the truth is it just has relatively low AR, and the Ash of War isn't the most damaging Ash. Yeah, the katana itself too, you think it would be great against dragons because you're going to be doing lightning damage, but the problem with the katana itself is that of course it's slash damage, which they're highly resistant to, so it ends up just being okay against most of the dragons in the game. Well, at least it sounds cool in Ice Lightning Sword. For equipment for this one, we have the Dragonscale Blade. Any seal for buffs, it really doesn't matter which one you're using. You can check out the armor set there. We have the Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Lightning Scorpion Charm, Ritual Shield Talisman, Lightning Tier, Fate Tier. Let's jump into stats. And for stats, we have 60 Vigor, 24 Mind, 28 Endurance, 16 Strength, 60 Dexterity, 33 Faith with the Fate Tier. We want to get to the ability to use Halberd because that's going to boost the damage of Ice Lightning Sword, which we're using Golden Vow and Halberd to buff this. You can use Flame Grant Me Strength instead, but keep in mind that doesn't boost the lightning portion of the weapon. Next up here is the Spin and Freeze build, and this focuses on the Knight Rider's Glaive with Spinning Weapon and Cold Affinity. It's a good way to get quick frost build up and a good amount of damage in general. This is one of the most simple builds on this list, but it is a fun one to use. I have a good time every time I use Spinning Weapon, and it's a good way to get status build up, including frost. In a second here, we're going to go over equipment, stats, and everything you need to know for this strength build. For equipment, we have the Cold Knight Rider's Glaive with Spinning Weapon on it. Really fun Ash of War to use. Any seal for buffs. You can check out the armor set there. We hit 51 points for most of these. Shard of Alexander, Rottenwing Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, Ritual Swords Talisman. Then we have the Thorny Tier, Fate Tier. Let's jump into stats for this build. And for stats, we have 60 Vigor, 20 Mind, 35 Endurance. This is the same as most of the strength builds on here. 66 Strength, we're maxing our strength stat when we're two-handing it. 20 Dexterity, 25 Faith with the Faith tier. And then for buffs, we're going to be using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength to get good damage out of this build. And the next one up here is the Iron Knight, which focuses on a Banished Knight cosplay, but this time with the Iron Greatsword and one of my favorite Ashes of War in the entire game in Flaming Strike. The Iron Greatsword gets good damage from both Fire Affinity and Flame Art. I do recommend trying out both. If you're a Strength build, go for Fire Affinity, but if you want some versatility, you can run this as a Faith build, probably get around the same, if not a little bit more damage, and you'll have the versatility of a Faith build in Flame Art. I feel like it is an underrated Ash of War. It's a very good Ash of War. It does really good damage on the Ash itself, and then whatever weapon you're using, the substantial amount of AR difference, and then just fire damage being a great damage type for the base game as far as Elden Ring goes, makes it very, very reliable. Now, when DLC arrives, I suspect that fire damage isn't going to be as good. I hope they do a little bit with holy damage, and holy damage ends up being better because it's not really great for the end game at all. But as far as fire damage, yeah, it may fall off for DLC, but it's always going to be a great damage type as far as elemental damage for the base game. There's a lot of enemies that are weak or neutral to fire damage. This dragon actually takes increased fire damage. Tree avatars take increased fire damage. And then for zero fire resistance, you have bosses like Melania, Radagon, Morgott, and even Hoarah who all have zero and take the full complement of fire damage. This dragon ends up kind of ending in an anticlimactic way, but yeah, try out Flaming Strike if you haven't yet. You've probably seen it a lot on my channel. I used it with the Bandit Curve Swords a lot because they get a B in Flame Art, but it works with a lot of weapons and can increase your overall AR. Just to see how much damage you can get on the weapon, this one in Lightning Slash is a lot of fun, so try that out and see how much damage you can get, see what it brings your AR to on whatever weapon you're using, and check out the Fate scaling and Flame Art scaling on a lot of weapons. You're going to probably be impressed with it. Let's jump into equipment. For equipment, we have the Iron Greatsword and Fire Affinity, but you get more versatility out of Flame Art. We have the Banished Knight Shield, Banished Knight Set-On. We have the Shard of Alexander, Fire Scorpion Charm, and then I forgot to equip the Ritual Shield Talisman for some defense. Wanted Ritual Shield for the extra defense. You can go Ritual Sword if you want more offense. We have Erdtree's Favorite +2. We have the Fire tier, Faith tier. Let's jump into stats for this one. Big highlight, by the way, for strength builds in this video. Definitely got a couple in here. We have 66 strength again, although this time we're not two-handing it. We have 60 vigor, 20 mind, 35 endurance, 25 faith with the faith tier. For buffs, we're using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. Flame Grant Me Strength's better here than Hal because we're doing both fire and physical damage, which means we're going to get 20% from the fire part of the boost in Flame Grant Me Strength as well as the physical portion, making it really good buff for this build. The next build up here, we have all status effects, and this one is pretty incredible in terms of damage. It does a lot of damage. This is a really fun one to use too. A lot of people asked for a build for the Antspear Rapiers, and I decided to do one that does bleed, frost, and rot build up. Now, you can opt for poison too, but for me, poison's kind of weak in Elden Ring, so I didn't go for that. Instead, I went with Seppuku on one and Chilling Mist on the other to run it as a frost and bleed build that also does rot build up. In there, we're able to get a couple of bleed procs and a frost proc too. The Antspear Rapiers are really good for status effects, and we're going to go up to Renala as quickly as we can and try to take her down fast. By the way, if you're using this timestamped and you didn't see early in the video, be sure to comment your most fun build or the weapons in Elden Ring that you have the most fun with, the ones that are most addicting for you as far as builds go. I'm curious as to your thoughts. I have a lot of favorite builds for me personally. There's a ton. I've mentioned Ice Spear, the Fire Swords, Fire Incantations, Vernal Flame. There's a lot of fun builds in Elden Ring. There's so much you can do with it. By the way, as far as the Antspear Rapiers go, if you can only get one, you can use an offhand Rapier and Cold Affinity, and that'll give you good damage too. Yeah, you can definitely use an offhand cold one and just start with the first one to proc rot. We have two here, one with Seppuku, one with Chilling Mist, Blood, and Cold Affinity. We have the White Mask, Kindred Rot's Exaltation, Millicent's Prosthesis, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Thorny tier, Fate tier. Let's jump into stats for this one. And as far as our stats go, we're a Dexterity and Arcane build. It's kind of a quality weapon, but it leans a little bit more towards Dexterity. So we have 45 Dexterity, 45 Arcane for the soft cap there. Then we have 60 Vigor, 20 Mind, 26 Endurance, Golden Vow, and Flame Grant Me Strength for our buffs. Now for number 9, we have a Poise Break build. I was looking for different ways to posture break on New Game Plus 7 because 30% increase in Poise makes every boss very difficult to break, and two-handed hammers do incredible Poise damage. For anyone that's catching up before DLC, there was a nerf across the board pretty much on all Poise, and it mostly affected bigger weapons. Now, when they did that nerf, they nerfed everything across the board except two-handed regular hammers, which actually received a buff instead. So there's a lot more limiting stuff now to Poise breaking. Some of the bigger weapons like the Giant Crusher seem to do virtually no posture damage now, which is a real disappointment, but as far as two-handed hammers go, the charge attacks are relatively quick and it's a good way to posture break. And with Craigblade on most of the two-handed regular hammer options, you're going to get around 700 AR of pure physical damage, which isn't bad either, and you're going to be doing strike damage, which also is not a bad damage type. As far as this Dragon and Caelid, he has around, I think, 120 Poise, which means by New Game Plus 7 he'll probably have around 150. We did manage to get a posture break on him, and had he had a little bit more HP, we probably would have gotten 2. And the fact that two-handed hammers have a relatively quick charged attack gives you a nice bonus too, because sometimes you can get, as I mentioned, 2 charge attacks in for what you would normally get with some of the bigger colossal weapons where you would get 1. Yeah, Poise is not the same as it used to be. It used to be a really good method for taking things down. Flame of the Redmanes obviously had its day. There were so many things. Even Craigblade did get hit. It's still good. It's just not as overpowered as it used to be. But Poise breaking definitely is a lot harder than it used to be. Let's jump into equipment. For equipment, we have the regular hammer and heavy affinity with Craigblade. Any seal for buffs. We have 51 Poise. You can check it out there. Ritual Sword Talisman, Claw Talisman, Dagger Talisman, Axe Talisman, Spike Crack tier, Faith tier. Let's jump into stats for this one. For stats, we have 60 Vigor, 20 Mind, 35 Endurance, 66 Strength. When we're two-handing it, we're maxing our Strength stat, 15 Dexterity, 25 Faith with the Faith tier. Then for our buffs, we're using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength, and then Craigblade itself also adds physical damage as well, which allows us to get the hammer around 700 AR. And the last build on here is probably the least powerful, but it's a lot of fun to do, and this involves the Serpent Bow. Now, there are better bows in terms of what you can use because Barrage is really effective, but the Serpent Bow has arcane scaling and will add bleed buildup and poison buildup to your arrows. On top of allowing bleed and poison arrows to scale with the bow, you'll also get a little bit of innate poison buildup on each arrow too, although it does take a long time that route. If you switch to poison though, it's much faster than even a normal bow per arrow, because you're going to get essentially, I think around 15, I don't know how much it is, or 30 poison added, whatever it is, to each arrow. So you're going to have your base poison amount scaling and then innate poison added on top of that. All that talk about poison though, and it's still a relatively slow way to take down bosses, so instead, even though it won't scale with arcane, we started with rot, we got a proc here, and after that we're going to switch to some blood arrows. So I do end up getting beat up by the Magmorm a little bit here. He's pretty stout as far as status effects goes. He actually has decent resistances against it, but it was fun to take him on with a bow and to try a bow build. Make a bow build, try to get some damage out of it, status effects or whatever, even if they're not as good as they should be. I'm hoping DLC adds more to the regular bows. We need something more. I know, I get it. They're supposed to be a backup weapon. They help you take out mobs from a range, and they're supposed to be kind of more of a convenience item to have secondary to whatever you're using, but it'd be nice to completely build around them. So that's definitely something I would be looking forward to in DLC too, is if they make the bow class better so that you could take on the majority of bosses with regular bows. Great bows can be pretty good, no doubt about it, but everything I think bow related needs an improvement. So comment that too, if you think bows as a whole needs to be improved, and if you would use bows more often if they were improved. Even if they were pretty good, not amazing, not super overpowered, would you use them more if they were buffed or at least made more sensible for Elden Ring? For me, I definitely would use them more, no question about it. I would use bows more if they were a little bit better, and I would probably try to make some really cool and fun builds around them. I think they could be fun, but the problem with them is they just lack damage. As far as the physical damage component, especially on regular bows, it's really low. By the way, I was going to mention this earlier, but if you notice in this video, I did slow down my talking a little bit. I've been sick for the past 7 days. It's still lingering, unfortunately, so that's part of the reason. But also, I tried to slow down my talking and kind of like read from talking points to see if you guys like that better. In a second here, we're going to jump into equipment. And for equipment for the bow build, we have the Serpent Bow, preferably +10. We're using Bloodbone arrows and Rotbone arrows. We have any seal for buffs. We have the Mushroom Crown on. We have well over 51 Poise. You can check out the armor set there. We have the Arrow Sting Talisman, Arrow's Reach Talisman, Kindred of Rot's Exaltation, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Greenburst Crystal tier, Faith tier. Let's talk about stats. And for the bow build stats, we went with Dexterity and Arcane, so we have 40 Dexterity and 45 Arcane, 60 Vigor, 20 Mind, 26 Endurance. Keep in mind the most important stat for this bow is the 45 arcane for poison, blood, and sleep arrows. And for the journey we're currently on, we were jumping into Journey 32 before this began. I know a lot of people ask me about the current journey. Once you're on New Game Plus 7, Journey 8 though, it does not scale any higher after that. Yeah, so max scaling, and this is my farthest along character, probably one of the characters I'll be taking on DLC. I'll probably do DLC at New Game Plus 7 at some point. Thanks for watching this one. If you enjoyed it, definitely be sure to sub. Now that recently we've got some of the overpowered stuff out of the way with some of the bigger videos, we're going to head back and do some fun off-meta stuff. Of course, I'm going to pull as always, and whatever ends up winning in the pull I usually end up doing, and we're going to do my top 8 in each damage stat ahead of DLC too. I'm really looking forward to the future of this channel. I love this community. I'm looking forward to Elden Ring DLC. It's going to be amazing, and I will catch you guys soon.